Hi there, I'm Karis Simone. Welcome back to my channel, and today I'm doing something a little bit different, but I wanted to preface this video by saying it ended up being a lot longer than I originally intended, so I'm going to be breaking it up into parts. This video is just going to be part 1 of the series, and as a result, some of the language I use makes it sound like it's all one video, but just know that this is only the first part, and I plan to upload the second part next week. Also, my mic was a little weird while I was recording this, and I didn't notice it until playback, but because the video is so long, I'm not going to have time to go back and re-record the entire thing, so please just bear with it. Still wanted to throw in that disclaimer, because obviously my mic doesn't always sound like that. But that was all for my little introduction. Please, without further ado, enjoy the video. Alrighty. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. I'm Karis Simone, and today I'm going to take you guys through my digital art process. We're just going to play around and do a quick little piece, and really I'll just be showing you guys how I make my work, my process, the tools I use, and my favorite little tips and tricks. So, to start out, this is the program I use. It's called firealpaca. It's free. It's an online program that can be easily downloaded to both Windows and Mac, and very user-friendly. And I've been using this program, I would say, for a little over 2 years now. The reason I went with it initially was because it was free, which is definitely a plus for anyone who's just starting out and really wants to, begin their journey in digital art, because a lot of times people encourage others to invest in these great programs, which is great if you have the means, but if you don't, there's no point in wasting a ton of money on a drawing program when there are perfectly good programs out there that are free and that can be made way more useful than people would think. So for firealpaca, I think the reason I've stuck with it all this time later, even though now I'm more developed into digital art, is just the fact that I have all my brushes on here. I've really grown with the program and I feel comfortable using it, and I don't really feel disadvantaged by using this program. So that's my little blurb on firealpaca. I'd highly recommend it to anyone, really, who needs a little space to draw some digital art for free. That being said, I've got a few brushes on here that I made myself, and so when I go through my process, just know that these brushes don't come with the program when you first get it. I made these, and basically the way I did that, which took me so long to actually find out I can do this, is using these buttons down here, add brush group. And you are going to select bitmap if you're doing it the same way I did. And what that does basically is open a window, and you'd upload a transparent image of something maybe similar to this. And what you're going to do is when you upload that, it's going to duplicate that pattern and create the brush. And something like this is exactly what I uploaded to create this brush here, which gives you more of a, I like to call it like a pencil, graphite looking texture, because when you go soft, it does kind of resemble a pencil, but then when you're gritting down really hard, you can also get some nice definition on there. So what I would do is research different brushes that kind of look similar to what you're going for, and then see if you can find like their bitmap or their original transparent image that they used to create that brush, and then see if you can replicate it yourself. That's the thing that I found to be the easiest when I was looking for brushes for firealpaca, because I quickly realized that because this is a program that not as many people use, it being free and all, there aren't a lot of whole brush packs. There's not a whole lot of brush packs out there that are already created, already made. So a lot of times you're going to end up having to make them yourself, but the benefits to that is that when you do make them, they'll be exactly how you want them. All your settings will be completely customizable, and you'll never have to make it again after you made it once. So yeah, that's my little blurb about brushes. If you guys are interested in a whole video on brushes and different types of brushes and how to make them, specifically in firealpaca, of course, then make sure to comment that down below and I'll be happy to record one. So we're gonna start in with this brush here that I have called Sketch. And when I start my digital art, I like to start with a color. Usually something a little less saturated, a little lighter, and something that's going to be in the color palette that I plan to be working with. If I don't know, then I'll just shoot for something random, and then I'll just get right into sketching. So for this particular image today that I'm going for, it's just going to be something quick. It's going to be something simple, just so I can show my process a little bit. And of course, because people are my artistic comfort zone, it will most likely be a character. And basically, everything I'm going for in my first sketch, whenever I draw, is loose. It's not meant to be perfect, it's just meant to get blocking and really some idea of the general motion of the character. And because it's digital, you don't have to worry about it being messy or anything like that. It's mostly just almost to work out a thumbnail for the character. And so here, I think I'm going to go for something more like a princess, you know, with really puffy sleeves based on this silhouette. Kind of give some fluid lines. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that layer a little lighter. I'm going to go in right on top of it and make this same sketch brush a little bit smaller. And make the color a little bit darker. And go in and start refining some traits of the drawing. But still in a very loose way. Still with no kind of pressure for it to be perfect or for it to have any intense line work yet. Still just trying to get an idea for the character and where I'm trying to go with this piece. I do kind of switch back and forth between styles, art styles. And I know that's definitely a controversial topic within the art world. A lot of people, you know, argue about the concept of an art style and whether it's truly important, whether it's overhyped, and, you know, I have a separate video planned to talk about that, but to kind of preface a little bit of what I'll be mentioning in that video, I would say that I personally don't glom onto a particular art style myself, and I find that that's simply because the pressure to have an art style and to kind of stick within the confines of something, even if it's something that I've defined for myself, oftentimes takes away my motivation to create art at all. And so when I'm drawing this point in my life, I just kind of go with it and just start. And I don't necessarily worry about what style it's in. I don't necessarily worry about if the details that I've put into one piece are consistent with the details I've put into other pieces, because I find that that is what actually keeps me creating, is not worrying about what it looks like in comparison to my other art. And I find this is especially true now that I've started uploading my pieces onto Instagram and social media. I feel like apps like those really encourage you to be consistent with your style and have one way of doing your art, because that makes you more marketable, I guess. Which is another issue in and of itself, you know, whether or not, or another conversation, I would say, in and of itself, of whether or not that's something that's healthy, or if that is productive, or if that's, you know, the future of art. But I would say that I personally just try to stay true to whatever the art is in the moment. I think I want to add a bouquet of flowers right here. I know now she's gonna look like a bride or something, but I don't particularly want to draw her hands, and so I'm gonna hide them. And it's just, you know, little changes like that that get made during the sketch phase, or at least for me. Again, I will say in this video that these are just all the steps and processes that I go through. Doesn't mean it's necessarily right or wrong. Really, everyone has their own way of doing things. But if you have a different way, like, that's cool too. So now that I've kind of finished a more refined sketch layer, I'm going to go in with a more saturated, a little bit deeper color, and a little bit of a finer brush one last time. And now I'm going to start to get into more detailed work. Still not line work, of course, but definitely a considerable amount of detail where now the primary aspects of the piece are starting to come out. And this is also where I'd start flipping the piece at this point in the drawing, because actually what that's going to do is it's going to help my sketch come out as symmetrical as possible. Not that symmetry is necessarily important. Not that symmetry is necessarily important in all pieces. In some pieces, it doesn't matter. But for me, when I'm drawing people especially, I do find that flipping the piece and seeing the face from both sides does help the face look more human and anatomically correct. Especially when it comes to eyes. I tend to draw them pretty womp-sided when I'm freehanding, and so flipping it helps eliminate some of that human error. If you hear clicking, that's my pen, because I draw with a pen tablet. So yeah. When I go in with the sketch, it is important to note that I'm starting to add more detail, of course, but also some line weight differences, because I find that the sooner I get those kinds of weights figured out, the easier my line work ends up being. My trick for line work and making a satisfying piece of line work in general would just be to kind of pay attention to the movements of your lines. This is especially true with hair. I, for the longest time, could not draw hair for the life of me, and it took so many tutorials and watching other artists actually just draw for me to kind of understand even what I was doing wrong. And at the time, what it came down to was me putting too much pressure on every single line to be important. And so what I mean by that is on the side here you can see like hair that's drawn more like how I draw it now, you know, a little bit better, a little bit more realistically when it comes to strands. Just ignore how it's a little crooked, it's not perfect. But how I would used to draw hair is just like kind of put equal emphasis on every piece and kind of overdo it when it came to lines, and so I would end up with something more like this. And so in my effort to make it more realistic and emphasize every single strand of hair, it ended up not looking like hair at all. And so what you're going to notice ends up being more important is these gaps. Here, let me do a different color so it's easier to see. These gaps and areas where there's space in the hair. That's what's going to end up being more important. And also these points right here where it kind of clumps together and you're seeing a central point. the balance between all different concepts is really what's going to end up making your hair look more realistic. Especially for a digital character with a lot of hair, the more hair you have, the more important those concepts are. And so, even in what I've done now, you can see there's gaps, like the one right there. There's white space, like right there. And then there's also these bunches of where many lines meet to kind of form a natural end point to the hair, to give some contour and movement to the hair. And those three factors are really going to be what drives home whatever style you do. Even if it's curly hair, a lot of the same rules apply. There's a lot more dynamic going on, and so curly hair is typically a little harder to draw. But for the most part, if you stick with those three key points in a hair, you should always end up with something that looks somewhat realistic. So I'm going to get rid of that layer and continue.
Hi there, editing Karis back once again. I have quite a few areas in this video where I just was drawing and I didn't speak because I actually did record the voiceover at the same time live while recording the screen record. And I did want to add in here that a big part of getting good at hair is also just observing life, looking at people, not in a creepy way of course, and trying to mimic what you see.
A lot of the same rules, I will say, a lot of the same rules that apply to hair also apply to clothing when it comes to space, bunching, and when it comes to space, bunching, and gaps. You do want to use a lot of the same rules. The only difference is, depending on fabric, depending on placement, and movement of the fabric, you do want to emphasize some areas that may not be emphasized with hair. For the most part, everything's just going down with hair, unless you've got some kind of like futuristic or like really voluminous updo going on. But otherwise, if you're doing something pretty normal or pretty realistic, I would say, a lot of the time the hair is carrying a downward motion in most areas. Whereas with fabric, that might not always be the case. Many fabrics sit many different ways, and so you may have a shirt that kind of floofs outwards, similar to how these sleeves on this shirt do. And then you're going to need to use the lines to convey that movement. Or you may have something like a velvet dress or something, very heavy fabric, and it'll droop down. And then you'll need to convey that motion through the lines. Or you can have a fabric that's very static. And in that case, your lines are going to be more neutral, because they're not going to be really giving any specific directional cues. It's really all up to you. And as you continue to draw more and more fabrics, more and more hairstyles, you'll just figure out like what you gravitate towards, and that'll be the thing you draw more often. So here I'm going in with a loose sketch of the ribbon. Not sure if I like it yet, but this is still a sketch, so there's plenty of time to fix it, or to go back and change it entirely. And I think that's what I like more about digital art when it comes to, the constant comparison between digital and traditional art. I do think that digital has the advantage of being more fluid, more flexible, easier to fix mistakes, and overall just less stressful. Because because I find with paint, a lot of the things you do are set in stone, which makes it a lot more valuable as a craft, sure, to some people, but also makes it very, very stressful. So digital definitely has its benefits. So what I went in and did now was combined all of my layers, keeping their original opacities, so that the one that I just did is the most saturated layer and everything else just kind of fades into the background. And so now collectively, I'm going to make that all a little bit less saturated. And then I'm going to move it to be bigger, because I basically worked on a really small scale. When first doing this sketch, just to kind of get more of a thumbnail. Now I'm going to be actually going in and doing line work on more of a detailed level. And so for that, I'm going to change my brush to this line art brush I made. Now I'm going to change my brush to this line art brush I made. Basically the difference between this brush and my sketch brush is that it's just a lot darker, if that makes sense, more saturated. You can also see there's like varying levels of pigment, as if it was like an inky pen. So there's some dots in there depending on how soft you press. But I like that because it makes my line art look a little softer than just if I had went in, for example, with this pen. This pen's a lot more harsh than this pen. You can see that from the edges. Like if I make this brush bigger, for example, you can see how that one's pretty harsh. When I make this one bigger, there's actually quite a big difference. So that's why I used the line brush that I made, and that's why I made it a little bit softer. So now when I go in with the line work, I typically start with the face. And my goal here is to take all of the little cues that I had as to line density before, and then to just make it 10 times more dramatic. So it gets a little thicker in the lash, and I'm going to really emphasize that, so that my line work has more of a character to it. And usually, even though my lines don't typically stay black, I do draw them all in black, just so that they're completely visible to me and I can see all of the weight of each line as accurately as possible. Because when you're using a color, sometimes it gets a little harder to see those details. For the most part, I'll try and keep my lines more fluid, so it does look like line art and not a sketch. So for example, when I go like right here and I go over a little bit and overlap them, then I'll go back and erase it and clean it up. And then in some areas where lines are overlapping on purpose, I kind of darken it a little bit, if that makes sense. So that the areas where lines are meeting looks a little bit more concentrated in weight. And I like to think this gives the line work more depth. It's a trick that I've seen done a lot with other artworks, especially people who draw in more cartoony styles, even something more like a comic book that could be considered cartoony but could also be considered like semi-realistic. They kind of employ the same tactic, even with like harsh black lines, where there's a lot of cell shading, but there's also a lot of like emphasis in certain corners of where multiple lines are meeting.
Editing Karis back again to add that I also zoom out quite a lot when I draw. And the reason for that is typically when I'm in there and I'm just looking at small details, I can't see the big picture for what it is. And something that I'm nitpicking might actually be alright. So that's another thing you'll see me doing quite a lot.
Another thing I try and do is I play with the stabilizer, depending on what I'm drawing. Like when I get to hair, you know, the stabilizer does help a lot with keeping my lines smooth. Especially when it comes to line work. Like when you're sketching, it doesn't matter as much. But when you're doing your line work, you want your lines to be as loose and in line as possible, if that makes sense. And the stabilizer definitely helps with that. It makes it a lot easier to get everything down in one stroke, which makes your line work look a lot more like it's moving, if that makes sense. Movement is probably the most important part of line work. And I guarantee you, a lot of the best line works were done using some kind of stabilizer. Because after a certain point, you know, the human hand just cannot stay stable and make these really, really straight or these really like delicately curved lines. Like human hands just can't all do that all the time and not consistently. Eventually your hand's gonna get tired and you're gonna be doing the same line over and over and over again. So the stabilizer is a really great tool, and I would not hesitate to use it in parts of your art where you definitely want to have some clear definition, some very nice flowy lines, some articulate movements.
Another thing I'd add about the stabilizer is I distinctly remember when I first started digital art, I used to feel like I was cheating by using it. So, to anyone out here who is starting digital art, don't be afraid to use the tools that come with the program. It's not cheating. You're not any less of an artist for using them. They're there because somewhere along the line, when the developers were making the program, they said, this tool might make the artist's life easier. So, definitely use them.
And there we are. Flip it for good measure. And I would say that's pretty balanced. I'm definitely going to end up lowering the mouth because I do think that that's a little bit too high. But that's easily fixable through a feature called Transform. And I'll show you that a little bit later because I like to do that after the line work's completely done. So we're going to move on to clothing. One thing I like to do when I'm doing line work is some cell shading, and I definitely do take inspiration from comic books when I shade in that way, because comic books do use a lot of black. They have a lot of harsh shadows. And so I like to employ that as well, although my line work itself rarely stays black as the color. And so the way that I'm able to soften some of those shadows is basically protecting the alpha layer, which I will show you when I get to that step in my process. And what that thing is going to do, what that tool is going to do, is it's going to preserve all of my lines, all of the weights, the placement, everything basically. And all it's going to allow me to do is change the value within those lines. Basically like coloring in a stencil, kind of. If that makes sense. It will when we get there. But the benefit of that is it allows me to make those big sections of like black a color that's close to whatever I end up coloring it in, so it doesn't look as harsh, but it's gives more of a cartoony air about it. Because I do find that I bounce back and forth quite a bit between semi-realism and straight up cartoon art when it comes back to, you know, that conversation of art style. I would say most times I rest somewhere in between those two definitions. It's very rare that I go all out and draw something extremely realistic. Usually that requires a level of technicality that I'm just personally not necessarily incapable of, but, you know, that I'm just not always down for, because it takes a lot of patience, it takes a lot of perfection, and sometimes that's not the move, you know, that's not the vibe I'm going for. I think that's another thing I like about the cartoon style. Cartoons actually don't have to be perfect either. At least not in the way that realistic or realism inspired pieces do. Cartoons are only loosely based on reality. So, a majority of it actually doesn't have to be anything specifically. And I enjoy that. I used to and I don't know if this is like a common thing with a lot of artists. I feel like it is, but I feel like in art classes and in general in like art media, the cartoon as a concept and having a style that is more cartoony is kind of looked down upon as being like less technically gifted, or, you know, as a less hard way of drawing, and I just don't think that's true. It takes plenty of skill to be able to draw a cartoon, just the same way it takes plenty of skill to be able to paint something like the Mona Lisa. And I feel like as someone who spent so long trying to be an artist who paints the Mona Lisa and then just ending up finding out that, oh, you know, these cartoons are actually way more fun to draw. I definitely see that now, that like your art style for one shouldn't define how good of an artist you are, but also that drawing cartoons is just as time consuming, just as hard in some instances, depending on what you're drawing, honestly, and it requires just as much skill as drawing literally anything else. So I decided to throw some ruffles in here, mostly because I think this would make sense, like at the bottom of the bouquet. It's a little womp-sided, but I don't know if it matters that much. If it ends up mattering, I'll fix it. But might not, who knows? And then her arms kind of look like they're made out of fabric because of the creases I put in them, but that'll be a lot more clear when we get to the coloring. The next thing I like to do is take away my sketch, so I can really see what I've done. Because when you have your sketch in the back, it covers a multitude of sins when it comes to line work. Like, it looks way better than it would without it. And without it, you can really see more so what the actual finished piece is going to look like. And I'd say this is pretty good. I'd say this is what I was going for. Another note about the sketch, I'd say the reason why it makes your line art look better is it's almost acting as like a shading, and so you can't see each individual line as clearly as you are able to when you take that away. So now that I've got my line work layer done, I'm gonna move a new layer underneath it and that's going to end up being my block layer. But first, I'm going to make some changes to the line work using this transform filter, and this is the tool I was talking about that firealpaca gives you, and it basically allows you to kind of move around small elements and edit small elements of your drawing without affecting everything else, which is another reason that I really like digital art, because you can't do that with a painting. If you paint the nose too big, you gotta repaint the whole nose, and with digital art, that is not the case. Even something as simple as, for example, making your hair a little less voluminous. All I've got to do is select that, pull it in a little bit, deselect it, and that's all done, completely fixed. And yeah, there's gonna definitely be areas in the line work where the transition wasn't the smoothest. Lines may have started to overlap or duplicate in the wrong way, and it's very easy to go in line work and fix that, which is why I do it in the line work layer before I start adding color, because if you have color in there, then it gets a lot more complicated when you're having to repaint certain areas or reshade certain areas because the color duplicated wrong. When you're working with line art, it's way easier, especially if your line art's all the same color. So now I think I fixed the balance issues that I had, and we're gonna go into this blocking layer.
Alrighty, editing Karis back once again for one final time, because I think this is where I'm gonna put a cap on this video. As you can see, it is almost 40 minutes long, and now that I'm here, I actually think this video is going to be about 3 parts. 1 part for line art, 2 for blocking and the color, and then 3 dedicated to the second half of coloring, as well as the effects and the finishing things that I do on all of my art, which is really, you know, the more lucrative part, because that's what I think really makes my art my art. So that's all for this video, but definitely be on the lookout next week for part 2, and I hope that you enjoyed. Be sure to drop a like on this video if you liked it, and comment down below what you thought was the most surprising about my art style or art process. Thank you for watching.